There we go. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Naval Association of Canada, the Montreal Division, and thank you, of course, for showing up to this talk. My intention is not for you to criticize the talk as much as it is for this talk to be sort of a hand grenade to stimulate your comments and what you think is going to happen with China. So if you could make the focus of this talk what you think is happening and not the paper itself. Skipping the sort of the formal titles, I'm a professor of war studies at Concordia University in Montreal. I've, in previous decades, worked in and on Pakistan. I teach undergrad and graduate courses on war causation, and I have 3 strategic courses on conventional and nuclear weapons in China, and this lecture is largely drawn from it. My co-researcher and author is Levon Petrosian, though nothing discussed here can be attributed to his federal employers. So what I'd like to do today is generate discussion by showing you how I would use Mahan to predict when a war would happen between the US and China in the Pacific, when quite obviously Mahan did not have a theory of war causation. So I want to argue 3 things. First, Mahan is correct that the most efficient path to victory in a campaign involving a maritime dimension is to lure the enemy fleet into a decisive battle. Second, that Mahan helps us understand the range of Chinese strategic choices in their decision for war. And third, that the US Navy needs to put itself into harm's way if it's going to deter China. Now, Mahan has largely been discredited by the naval results of the First and Second World War. However, I will be challenging the current conventional wisdom, which is the Corbett approach. Well, you can see his portrait in the center here, which argues that seeking only local sea control is a sufficient operation for war victory. I disagree with that. Now, obviously, Mahan provided a path to naval hegemony. Mahan argued that navies need commerce and that commerce needs navies and that great powers therefore need navies and navies can change history. You can see here a picture on the bottom right of Paul Kennedy, who wrote a very important book, The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery, where he, I think, definitively falsifies these assumptions. You might recall him as the author of The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, but it was this book that brought him from Hull to Yale. So I'm not going to discuss this aspect of Mahan further. I'm also not going to be elaborating further on the ideological adoption of Mahan by the Imperial Japanese or the Wilhelmine Germans or by the Chinese, although I will raise it as an option later on in the talk. Now, just to set the empirical stage for the discussion, China had a modern fleet. In fact, it was the 8th largest fleet in the world by tonnage, but it had 2 German battleships that were modern and 2 British battleships that were modern. But following 10 years of no funding, it was summarily destroyed by the Japanese in 1894. And that was the destruction of the Beiyang fleet. So China did have a period of regional naval predominance, at least for a short period. No one expected China to lose to Japan. So my argument has many moving parts. So let's jump abruptly into the Mahanian assertions in the form of hypotheses. I obtained the hypotheses from a careful reading of these 6 Mahanian texts. So you can find most of these for free as a PDFs online at the Gutenberg Project. So you don't need to pay for any of these books now. You can basically read them on your computer. I will also present the hypotheses of what I would describe as the Corbett approach to naval strategy, named after Julian Corbett, Mahan's most articulate early critic. But it also includes a great many other authors in the same vein. And these you can see here in the Corbett bibliography. And all of these you can also download. Some of them are masterfully written and frankly quite easy to read. So formally, these here are the principal hypotheses proposed by Mahan. And you've already seen the first 3 hypotheses, which have already been falsified. These hypotheses here are the ones that relate to how how naval strategy should be conducted in order to produce a strategy. I'm not going to go through them specifically because I'm going to abbreviate them later on. But they're essentially derived from the British victory at Trafalgar, particularly the strategic maneuvering that preceded the actual battle. A large amount of the credit of which goes to Admiral Jervis and not Admiral Nelson. And it also applies in part to the decisive naval engagement of Jutland. So we can derive 3 hypotheses from Mahan that he didn't intend that apply to war causation. And these I'm going to go through in more detail. So hypothesis 11 is the benefits of surprise define the extent of mutual instability. Hypothesis 12 is superior initiative for the purposes of concentration may undermine enemy deterrence. And hypothesis 13 is existing opportunities to lure an enemy fleet increase the incentives to war. So all of these I'm going to elaborate on more as we proceed. These are the hypotheses from Corbett. Again, they're related to how to achieve victory, not war causation. So I'm not going to go into them in detail. But you can derive one hypothesis on war causation from Corbett, which is C hypothesis 4. The ability to avoid the main enemy battle fleet undermines enemy deterrence. So the Corbett anti-Mahanian approach has become the conventional wisdom since the US defeat of Japan in the Pacific during the Second World War. Specifically, the US managed to defeat Japan without seeking a decisive fleet engagement, and by using submarines in an anti-commerce role without achieving sea control. The US island hopped across the Pacific with a series of local and temporary sea control operations. Japan, which embraced Mahan, was defeated before it could engage in a victorious, decisive battle. But this campaign is not a fair test on which to judge Mahanian ideas, because both Mahan and Corbett hypotheses apply to peer competitors. Japan was nowhere near a peer competitor, with only a fraction of US manufacturing capacity. The US simply had to wait to achieve naval, primarily logistical superiority before beginning their push across the Pacific. If Japan had the same resources as the US, which is more akin to the Chinese-American confrontation today, it could have reciprocated with an anti-commerce submarine campaign and more effective convoys from Southeast Asia. It could also have continued its island hopping campaign to Australia, Madagascar, and Hawaii, and had more opportunities to compel the Allied fleets to take a stand. Now, both Mahan and Corbett agree about the benefits of a superior fleet in battle. That's not their disagreement. The inferior fleet will suffer an inverse hyperbolic tan difference in losses as captured by the Lanchester equation, which is shown on top. A small initial difference in forces in battle results in a disproportionate acceleration in the difference of the losses. Both Mahan and Corbett recommended avoiding disadvantageously weak battle situations and to seek out advantageous battle situations, primarily through superior initiative and maneuver at sea. Here you can see 2 groups, red and a blue, whether it's land, tanks, or aircraft or ships. You have one starting with 200 units or ships, or throw weights of shells or anti-ship missiles, whatever increment of weapon you want to use, and the other has 190 ships. So there's a 5% difference, but a 5% initial strength difference translates into complete annihilation for blue and 70% loss for the stronger side, which is red. But red prevails with a large extra force. This here shows a difference of 25%. So red starts at 200, blue starts at 150, blue is completely annihilated, and red loses only 30%. And so this is an emergent property of nature. It's not the only variable that matters, but in their non-mathematical sense, both Mahan and Corbett have focused on this dynamic as determining when fleets should engage in battle. Now, Raoul Castex, who's in the portrait on the top left, who's a French anti-Mahanian, whose book is listed in the bibliography, came closest to the intuitive understanding of naval maneuver as a mixed game strategy. Castex, like many naval theorists, grappled with how to maneuver against an adversarial fleet in order either to isolate a portion of their fleet for destruction or to avoid contact. Now, a mixed game strategy is a math that predicts outcomes when the strategy that produces the greatest payoff for a player depends on the strategic choice of the opponent. It can be described in a discrete value strategic form game, which is what you see here, which is the most simplest form. And most interestingly, it has a mathematical proof from John Nash, who you can see on the top right, which shows it to be the optimal method to determine an equilibrium. And this applies directly for how ships maneuver against each other. Now, the testing implication of the mixed game strategy is that we cannot judge Mahan by a single attempt at a decisive battle, like the Battle of Midway. Since decisive mixed game strategy outcomes are probabilistic, we need to examine its stochastic distribution, which no one has yet done. Nor is Midway a demonstrated falsification of Mahan. The Japanese attempted entirely legitimately to lure out the US fleet over the island of Midway without a full complement of carriers due to losses in the Coral Sea campaign, and while trying to distract the US fleet with an assault in the Aleutians. It was a worthwhile gamble that failed, and otherwise should be tried again in an alternate reality. I could not find anything in Mahan's texts that specifically reject the idea of the Midway campaign. Now, there is a lesser dispute over the implications of a case for Mahan, and this is on the issue of anti-commerce submarine operations. Submarines seem to indicate it is cheaper to engage in effective anti-commerce operations than surface operations. But sea control relying on surface ships provides a less porous blockade against large vessels. The dispute centers on historiographic interpretations of evidence of how close Germany came to isolating the United Kingdom in both world wars. This dispute, frankly, remains unresolved. It brings into question Corbett's hypothesis, his third hypothesis, which is that effective anti-commerce operations do not require sea control. Now, there's another disagreement between Mahan and Corbett over the benefits of a fleet in being. I put a paragraph in the notes, but I'm not going to elaborate on it here because I don't think it's that important. There is another dispute, a final dispute between Mahan and Corbett regarding the degree of sea control required for seizing and holding of bases. Again, I go into further elaboration in the notes. Certainly, there were large naval campaigns fought in the Coral Sea over the fighting in Guadalcanal and the attempt to arrest the Japanese advance on Australia. And of course, there are many studies looking at the difficulty of conducting amphibious operations without air or sea cover. So in summary, both Mahan and Corbett agree that navies need not actually be concentrated all the time, but that they be mutually supporting. Mahan's focus is on destroying fleets, whereas Corbett's focus is on destroying bases, to contribute both to naval and land victory and early anti-commerce operations, guerre de course. Mahan requires luring of the enemy fleet to battle, which may cause a delay, but thereafter, the victorious fleet has freedom of action, whereas Corbett may proceed directly to local superiority. Both suffer, but suffers from constrained operations for the duration. Corbett and Mahan both put an opponent on the horns of a dilemma. You either focus on the enemy fleet or the enemy base and the support of ground operations. The hypotheses of Mahan and Corbett compete against each other for their description of the optimal strategy. But actually, their hypotheses are also complementary when it comes to predicting war causation. So what I have in the notes, which is pretty long, and in the updated notes that you can, the updated transcript, which you can find the link to in the chat at the bottom right-hand corner, is I put in a preliminary data set, actually a very rudimentary data set, because it's missing a large number of independent variables. And I manufactured this data set from notes and by going to Wikipedia over around 2 days. And my goal was to determine whether the pursuit of a decisive battle between peer competitors is worth the diversion of naval forces from their anti-commerce and land support missions. So I think this data set can give us a good partial initial insight. Now, based on peer-to-peer strategic naval contests in the period of 1600 to 1982, and you're going to find those individual campaigns at the end of the transcript, there are 35 naval campaigns resolved through a decisive battle along the lines of Mahan, and only 10 that are resolved along the lines of Corbett. The results indicate that the Mahan strategic pursuit of the decisive battle as a time and resource worthwhile effort to achieve victory in war is valid. So I think Mahan is right. Certainly, we should debate this because it's the basis for my subsequent conclusions. Now, an important aspect of Mahanian theory, which is worth elaborating, is that of luring, or the operational or strategic maneuver that draws the enemy fleet out to battle. Between severely asymmetrically capable adversaries, such as the US and Japan at the end of the Pacific campaign, a naval force may prevail against continentally based aircraft and coastal defenses. So the US could put groups of aircraft carriers together and approach the Japanese mainland and attack the land-based air directly. However, between peer competitors like China and the US, land bases are significantly stronger than fleets. So a direct littoral attack by a fleet disproportionately increases the fleet's rate of attrition. Fleets, however, can be lured out by coastal centers of gravity, which include bases, islands, coastal or transoceanic trade routes, or sea-based ballistic missile submarines that are vulnerable to attack. So in the current context of the Sino-US confrontation, these centers of gravity in my subjective order of vulnerability are as follows. You've got Chinese commerce, particularly energy, which transits through from the Indian Ocean. That's the most vulnerable. You've got the South China Sea, which if it's used as a ballistic missile bastion, has particular vulnerabilities. You've got Chinese bases in the South China Sea, which if they're isolated are quite vulnerable. You have economic military targets along the Chinese littoral, particularly islands that are close to China, like Xisha and Hainan Island. Now, the center of gravity for the US in their order of vulnerability, again, my subjective interpretation, are the islands northwest of the first island chain, including the outlying islands of Taiwan, Kinmen, Matsu, Penghu, and Pratas, the Senkakus, the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa. Then you have Taiwan, and then you have the Kuril Islands, which are in Russia, particularly the ballistic missile submarine zone, because if Chinese deploy their Jin-class ballistic missile submarines there, they can reach the continental US. So that's an important piece of geography of interest. And the South China Seas, in particular, Taiwan's Itu-Aba Island. Now, it should be emphasized that the South China Sea, in my opinion, is not a center of gravity for the US allied fleet, except insofar that the US can destroy surface platforms, land-based air, and anti-submarine warfare surveillance that would interfere with American submarines seeking to destroy Chinese ballistic missile submarines. The enclosed South China Sea is an optimal environment for long-range anti-ship missiles, making it an unnecessarily risky environment for a US carrier fleet. So the incentives for war causation created by the possibility of luring and the overlap of vital centers of gravity is well described by Mahan's 13th hypothesis, which is existing opportunities to lure an enemy fleet increase the incentives to war. The ability of the US and allied fleets to increase their safety by patrolling into the depths of the Pacific Ocean and the relative vulnerability of China's fleet bases on the coast reduces China's incentive for war initiation. China is vulnerable to cruise missiles launched by coastal submarines. Now, it should be pointed out that all conflict today occurs under the shadow of nuclear weapons. And so we have to explore Mahan and Corbett in the context of nuclear weapons. And I want to elaborate in particular on the issue of ballistic submarine bastions. Ideally, a silent ballistic missile submarine can patrol in the wide expanse of the oceans. However, louder submarines, and the Jin class has been likened on Wikipedia to being about as loud as a Delta III submarine. Louder submarines need patrol areas that are under the protection of anti-submarine warfare capable surface fleets and bases. A significant portion of the Soviet Cold War fleet was assigned to this mission. China's primary interest in the South China Sea has been as a buffer against foreign fleets, but secondarily as a ballistic missile submarine patrol zone, particularly in the south where it's deepest. The shallowness of the remaining Chinese littoral, it's only about 200 meters deep, including the Bohai and the Yellow Sea. And so these areas are unsuitable. It's in the same way that Canada's Hudson Bay, though very large, has an average depth of only 150 meters and therefore is not ideal for a ballistic missile submarine bastion. So the possible use of nuclear weapons by China in a confrontation over Taiwan brings certain advantages to Beijing and should be considered in any contemporary discussion of naval strategy. I'm not going to elaborate on it more. It's in the transcript, and there's some very interesting sources that I put in the footnote to that discussion. So these observations can be condensed into a nuclear hypothesis about the neutralization of a nuclear deterrent disincentive to war initiation, which I call nuclear hypothesis H1. A state's strategic belief that it can compel its nuclear armed adversary to constrain their nuclear weapons use despite provocations reduces the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons as a deterrent to the outbreak of war. Now, alternately, China may expand the conflict to attack space satellites, strategic intercontinental conventional hypersonic strikes, subnuclear ionization devices designed to cut power and blind radars, cyber attacks on US nuclear reactors, the use of chemical weapons, and even small micro nuclear weapons based on the belief that, that there exists what's called a stability-instability paradox. This paradox asserts that opposed nuclear arsenals, because of their overwhelming destructiveness and unpredictable escalation, have the effect of canceling each other out, thereby restricting war to conventional means only. Now, given the greater strength of the US nuclear arsenal over China, the neutralization of the US arsenal would provide China a significant advantage. Here you can see a border patrol between Russia and China. The evidence for the stability-instability paradox are the 1969 Sino-Soviet Border War, in which both states were, had at that time detonated nuclear weapons, although China's arsenal was quite limited at the time, and the 1999 Kargil border clash between nuclear India and nuclear Pakistan. Here you can see a tussle in 1969. This is where the tussle occurred across from the city of Khabarovsk. And there were other areas where you had regimental level clashes between the Soviet Union and China. Now, during the Cold War, NATO's solution to this stability-instability paradox, which is important, of course, because NATO depended on nuclear weapons for their deterrence, was that at the outbreak of war, NATO would immediately commit a significant multi-carrier flotilla into the Barents Sea to destroy the Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet by conventional means. If you want further elaboration, in the footnotes, there are articles that describe this strategy. Now, as the Soviets would only have just begun their conquest on land in Western Europe, they would want to avoid prematurely triggering a nuclear exchange. With the ballistic missile submarine fleet either destroyed or dispersing under the polar ice cap, the Soviet land-based missile silos would be exposed to a US first strike. The US advertisement of this strategy to the Soviets acted as a powerful deterrent, given that the only possible Soviet response was to initiate nuclear war at the outset of any conflict before their ballistic missile submarines were destroyed. Similarly, while China may use a limited and regional nuclear exchange to signal commitment against further conflict, perhaps once they've completed the conquest of Taiwan, it is unlikely to invite an early escalation to nuclear war while they're still conducting their amphibious landing. The US can consequently strengthen deterrence against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan by being explicit about a strategy to destroy China's 6 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines. Now, if China strikes regional bases such as Guam or Hawaii, then the US could supplement this with concurrent B-2 and conventional Trident strikes on China's mobile DF-31 tractor erector launchers. Now, Beijing may be aware of this counter-strategic deterrent strategy, and they may have counteracted it by obtaining Russian permission to conduct patrols of their Jin-class ballistic missile submarines within the protected Sea of Okhotsk, which you can see here. Which, you might recall way back in the 80s when the Korean airliner 007 got shot down over the Kuril Islands, it was because of this reason. This is a secondary nuclear bastion for Russian ballistic missile submarines. So this dynamic we could describe as a second nuclear hypothesis, which is that the threat of the conventional destruction of strategic naval nuclear deterrence platforms acts as a disincentive to a war initiation. Now, the strategic prescriptions of Mahan and Corbett are mainly deduced from the geographic nature of the oceans and the technical characteristics of warships. Strategically, compared with land warfare, sea movement is inexpensive and produces a winner-take-all outcome once a battle is decided. On their own, however, these Mahanian and Corbett hypotheses cannot be used to predict war, since no war has ever been initiated primarily due to a technical incentive to attack first. One of the telling cases is the Israeli cabinet decision to delay initiating war against Egypt in May and June of 1967, despite desperate warnings from the Israeli Air Force about the costs in aircraft and lives if they were not permitted to attack first. The cabinet voted for war only after approval was given by US President Lyndon Johnson. In other words, diplomacy trumps technical operating characteristics. And so we need to see Corbett and Mahan in the contexts of the grand strategy of the countries that adopt those naval strategies. So the likelihood of a Sino-US war in the Pacific depends on interacting military plans, which are in turn dependent on China's strategic culture and its political goals. China, to the extent that it has incentives to initiate war, can be categorized as having one of 3 types of strategic motivations. And the first here is tributary. China may be seeking to reestablish the geographic status quo ante of the early 19th century, prior to the century of humiliation, in which tributary states within China's sphere of influence sacrificed their foreign policies in exchange for a relatively benign hegemony. China seeks to establish a ring of tributary states for its intrinsic defense value, and its leaders will be highly risk acceptant and uncompromising until that's achieved. Once this geographic ring is secured, China will revert to a risk-averse status quo power and will uphold the prevailing international order. This is a hypothesis proposed by scholars interpreting the work of John K. Fairbanks. There is broad public support in China for these strategic goals. The military strategy associated with the Fairbanks hypothesis is the rapid seizure of formerly lost territory and the holding of it against counterattacks to achieve a political fait accompli. So here you can see a Chinese map of the territories that they think should be recovered, not physically recovered, but reincorporated into their tributary system. Here's a more conservative map from the middle of the 19th century. Here you can see a list of the lost territories and a list of the lost tributaries, which are significant. The second strategic motivation is realpolitik. China is seeking a redistribution of benefits in the international system commensurate with its emerging power, and is seeking to displace the US as the commercial, technological, maritime, military, and alliance hegemon. Here, China has unlimited ambitions and it's insatiable. Within this political framework, China is conceived of as having two possible naval strategic cultures, one based on Mahan, which focuses on the decisive naval battle, and or one based on Corbett, which seeks to avoid decisive naval action. There's not much evidence that China has begun an interest in Mahan, and its navy seems a natural evolution of coastal defense with a philosophy similar to that of Admiral Gorshkov. Once China has completed the conquest of Taiwan and the first island chain, it may transition to a Mahanian strategy of seeking a decisive fleet action to impose victory. Now, an important aspect of the likelihood of war and the timing of war is power transition. A decisive determinant of war is when the US and China cross over in terms of their total power. War outbreak typically occurs when the revisionist power, in this case China, surpasses 80% of the power of the prior great power. As of 2020, China's GDP was at 15.2 trillion, which is 73% of the US's 20.8 trillion. And you can refer to the transcript and the footnotes for a significant elaboration of why countries attack at 80% and not at 100 or 100%. By another indicator, that of industrial output, which is an important measure of the ability to manufacture weapons of war, China has already exceeded the United States way back in 2015. Now, the third motivation is domestic legitimation. China's military strategy is incoherent and is the product of the constellation of evolving and competing domestic forces. China's military is both an interest group, a key to the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party, and a publicly manipulated symbol. There are a variety of possible structural explanations for the domestic source of China's military actions, but they all share the common attribute that the regime is far more concerned with its domestic popularity than international strategic gains. Evidence of China's domestically driven foreign policy is its apparently irrational policy of self-encirclement, in which it has managed to provoke nearly all of its neighbors, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Myanmar, India, and antagonize the US, Indonesia, Philippines, Australia, Canada, Europe, much of indebted Africa, which may still default, and most states with fisheries. In fact, there was a border clash between North Korea and China, in which a Chinese border guard was killed. Further evidence for China's domestically driven strategic motivation are threefold. First, China has seriously neglected the creation of a coherent alliance. This is here my projection of what sides states would take in a medium-sized war. The blue are the US and their close allies. The green are countries that would likely support the US. Red is China, and yellow are countries that would possibly cooperate with China, but that's far from clear. We normally expect in a challenge by an unsatisfied power, in this case China, that it would lead a large coalition of middle powers and small powers. But China, it hasn't done that. Second, China has failed to appeal to a sympathetic fifth column in its adversaries, like the Soviet Union managed to do with left-wing components of foreign societies. Chinese in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore are demonstrably hostile to mainland Chinese occupation. Third, China has neglected to create a nuclear arsenal sufficiently large or diverse enough to offer extended deterrence to prospective allies, limiting China's ability to intervene in global affairs. However, the Soviet Union grew their arsenal from 0 in 1960 to 1,000 ICBM warheads by 1970 and a further 300 by 1980. China may do the same, although there is evidence that there are issues with its breeder reactors that limit the output of plutonium. Here you can see the estimates of China's arsenal by different US agencies, but in all respects, they're much smaller than the US arsenal. Another aspect, a very important consideration, are the specific domestic causes for a decision for war. I'm not going to elaborate on these because they're elaborated in the notes, but here is a grocery list of these different possible explanations. Now, once China's decided on initiating hostilities, the specifically active strategic motivation will determine the extent to which China pursues a strategy of surprise. There are three levels of suddenness from which China may attack: strategic surprise, tactical surprise, and extended buildup. So the first, strategic surprise. This would consist of a sudden attack with minimal preparations, using forces on station with the goal of overwhelming an opponent in a land attack to secure a fait accompli, or a surprise attack on military targets. This is a type of attack that NATO feared from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. A second level of surprise is tactical surprise. China may visibly deploy its forces in order to lure an allied fleet to the South China Sea away from Taiwan. Alternately, China may encourage or exploit an ongoing war as a cover for military preparations, such as the attack on India in October of 1962 that was conducted during the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and the Soviet Union. This stratagem requires further consideration. Iran is very unlikely to start a major war on behalf of China. You might have seen in the last few weeks, China and Iran signed a strategic agreement that so far the contents are secret. Though China may take advantage of a diversion of US forces to open the Straits of Hormuz, Pakistan is also unlikely to start a war against India without a significant Chinese military presence, and China risks Pakistan's defeat and balkanization, which you can see here represented in the map, and the permanent regional primacy of India on the subcontinent, which would not be in China's interest. North Korea is also unlikely to start a scale of conflict sufficiently broad to draw in the US without significant backing of China's air force and logistics. Furthermore, South Korea has stated publicly its reluctance to oppose a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and provoking South Korea into the US coalition would be unproductive for Beijing. The third surprise is the extended buildup. Given the provocation and the superior resources of an allied coalition of democracies, an extended buildup would be indicative of a demonstration of force consistent with a domestic strategic motivation. An extended buildup could also be a description of a step-level constriction of Taiwan, such as a declaration of a virtual blockade, raising ship insurance, or an actual blockade as a costly measure short of war. The problem with these measures is that virtually any blockade of China applies to Taiwan, that applies to Taiwan, can be applied in turn by the US against China. So let us now distill the relevant Mahan, Corbett, and nuclear hypotheses into their net effect on war outbreak. While these hypotheses are theoretical variables, in the context of the Western Pacific, because we have some sense of the values of geography and the capability of key actors, they become conditional variables, sort of constants. The net effect of the two nuclear variables, I think, cancel each other out. So they're sort of indeterminate. Corbett's fourth hypothesis argues that fleets that can outmaneuver their enemy and achieve local and temporary dominance of the sea in order to conduct operations will not be deterred. Soviet Admiral Gorshkov made a study of how the smaller German Navy surprised and outmaneuvered the British Royal Navy to seize Norway in 1940. Mahan's 11th and 12th hypotheses, which are the benefits of surprise and superior initiative, both contributing to warfare, is particularly telling because of the pathology of the democratic way of war. Democracies are typically always ill-prepared for war and take time to mobilize. Mahan's 13th hypothesis about luring the enemy fleet argues that the complex environment of overlapping possessions and interests in the Western Pacific provides an abundance of baits and traps for the opposing fleets. And a determinative final variable is whether the US deploys half its carrier fleet in the Western Pacific in a strong show of deterrence, or whether it pulls its navy back to Japan and westward of Indonesia to prepare to enforce a blockade of Chinese commerce and to deter Chinese allies from entering the war. So these Mahan and Corbett factors are aggregated as follows in the table. What you see on the left side are the four strategic motivations: the tributary, realpolitik with a Mahan variant, realpolitik with the Corbett variant, and domestic legitimation. And they're distinguished on different outcomes. You have the strategy that China's likely to adopt as a consequence of the strategic motivations under the strategy column, second from the left. The third from the left, you've got the impact of that strategy on the blockade. Sometimes it'll defeat the blockade, sometimes it won't. The third column is the extent to which China's strategy will provoke alliance mobilization. And obviously China does not want to provoke a high level of democratic mobilization. And then the two columns on the right look at the impact of US fleet deployment on deterrence, whether the fleet is deployed very close to Taiwan or whether it's deployed farther afield into the Pacific. So I'm going to elaborate on the results here. Domestic legitimation is the least difficult to deter, but may be indistinguishable from the other motives. It might be associated with the preliminary steps China takes before it embarks on one of the other strategic motivations. Tributary is difficult to deter because of the high costs China is willing to incur to rebuild what it had before, say, 1820. And there's widespread support within China for these policies. The decisive difference between a Corbett and a Mahan approach for China is that Corbett allows a focus on local territorial conquest at the cost of breaching the US allied blockade, which leaves unanswered how China will compel war termination to consolidate its gains, right? This is the same problem Japan had in World War II. A Mahan approach will, however, take more time as the plan and the US Navy maneuver and counter-maneuver for the decisive battle. And this high risk and high payoff strategy risks permitting the traditionally slow mobilizing democracies to achieve cohesion. An extended campaign will also increase the risk of the destruction of China's ballistic missile submarine fleet. If China's strategic motivation is tributary, its risk acceptance becomes very difficult to deter. China's operations will be to use surprise, to seize territorial objectives, and to hold onto them in order to create a political fait accompli. In fact, China might be so desperate that even if they land soldiers on the beaches of Taiwan and they lose, the regime may not be punished by the Chinese population. Mahan would prescribe luring the US allied fleet into a littoral action where it is disadvantaged, and then to seize by fait accompli the outstanding territorial claims, specifically the South China Sea, Taiwan, the Ryukyus, and possibly Indonesia's Natuna Island. However, the scale of an operation to destroy an entire US allied fleet would likely not be justified by the lesser effort prescribed by Corbett of seizing individual islands in surprise attacks. It is reasonable to assume that if China succeeds in consolidating its territorial goals, it was either through demonstrated superior Chinese strength or the failure of the organization of a timely democratic counter-coalition, and that any blockade resulting from the war will be abandoned to normalize world trade. Because the tributary strategic motive is a broadly held domestic strategic goal and therefore responds to costs at the Chinese domestic level, it may require a much higher threshold of external deterrence, and a US allied fleet deployment in depth will not deter, and a forward deployed fleet may also not be sufficient to deter. Now, if China's strategic motivation is instead realpolitik, with a Mahan strategic culture, then the goal will be to lure out the US allied fleet for destruction. In this formulation, the invasion force for Taiwan will receive fewer resources than the planned fleet sent to destroy the US allied fleet, with the thinking that if the US fleet can be destroyed, the consolidation of Taiwan would be unopposed. The added benefit of the destruction of a US allied fleet is China's immediate access to the Pacific and, to a lesser extent, the Indian Oceans, which would permit it to consolidate its gains further afield. If the US allied fleet is deployed in depth, it may need to be lured into place as part of an attack on Taiwan or its outlying islands. In neither case is China likely to be deterred. If China's strategic motivation is realpolitik with a Corbett strategic culture, then China's goal will be to engage in a succession of conquest operations in which the US allied fleet is subject to destruction by attrition and loss of bases. The problem with the Corbett approach is that it does not resolve the problem of the offshore US allied naval blockade, since no amount of inshore seizure of bases will create a breach in the blockade. A forward fleet able to deny Chinese dominance of the sea will deter the outbreak of war, whereas a fleet in depth will be not. So let us address the search for an optimal US deterrent posture. If China's strategic motivation is domestic legitimation, then China will continue a policy of aggressive harassment beneath the threshold of war and will be undeterred, regardless of the US allied fleet deployment. Because harassment will proceed under the threshold of war, no blockade will ever be instituted. The dilemma from the US standpoint is that a forward deployed fleet is more likely to suffer attrition and risk a decisive battle in unfavorable waters. But the loss of Taiwan to conquest will be unrecoverable, both militarily and because it will politically consolidate China's victory. It will also therefore undermine the blockade and counter coalition effort by the democracies. Because China may always evolve between a Mahan and a Corbett strategy, and a blockade is not likely to be of strategic significance, that's of course open to a large amount of debate, the US fleet should ideally deploy forward to maximize deterrence. To reduce vulnerability, the US fleet should be pre-delegated the freedom of action to prioritize operational security despite the risk of escalation. So a concluding thought, the key strategic implication of Mahan's assertions of the worthwhile prioritization of the destruction of the enemy fleet is that a US allied fleet, including Canada, should attack the planned amphibious force crossing the Straits of Taiwan only insofar as it leads to drawing out the Chinese fleet and land-based maritime aviation. Now, I want to show you just a couple of other sources of inspiration. This is Hector Bywater. He wrote a book called The Great Pacific War, in which he basically deduced many of the key developments during the American campaign against Japan in the Second World War, and he did it by wargaming, which is what I do with my students. Here you can see Bywater's 3 naval routes to Japan. So this means that we can intellectually anticipate what China's going to do. It's not that difficult. Hector Bywater showed us that it can be done. He did it by doing a very close study of logistics, and his book challenged the prevailing wisdom at the time that the US fleet would simply sail to the Philippines and then fight the Japanese. So we should be mindful of the details. I use Harpoon with my students, and they've run one simulation, which is a China attack on Taiwan, which of course being the Harpoon simulation, it focuses on naval and air units hundreds of times by now. And I've been using the simulation for well over a decade and almost 2 decades. But there are also land simulations. This is a simulation I played in 2017 with a landing at Kaohsiung. This is one that I ran, I believe, a year later with some different students, which looked at a landing in central Taiwan. And I want to point out this game, published in 2006 by a war game company in Beijing. So we're not only involved in an arms race, we're involved in a war game race. So to not fall behind, it's important that we as a community continue to intellectualize and to think of ways to simulate these so we can get the rough outlines of how conflicts are likely to unfold.